In 1867, trail cook Charles Goodnight attached a simple wooden box to the rear of an army wagon, and that small invention helped reshape American history. Inside were the basics: beans, bacon, and coffee that kept cowboys going across long, grueling miles of rough terrain and harsh conditions. Today, many imagine cowboys dining on steak every night beneath the open sky, but the reality was far more modest. In fact, one item, listed as number 14, was considered so unsettling at the time that journalists from the East labeled it as crude and even barbaric. Yet it kept more men alive than any other dish on the frontier. Number 3 contains an ingredient that modern chefs are only now rediscovering. These 25 meals were so practical that Hollywood spent decades replacing them with prettier fiction. Real cowboys ate things that would make a modern American push away from the table. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten meals that actually fueled the cowboy era. Number 25, hardtack. Before refrigeration, before canning became cheap, hardtack kept men alive across the frontier. These dense squares of flour and water were baked until every drop of moisture vanished. They could survive years in a saddlebag without spoiling. Army quartermasters issued them at a rate of 9 crackers per day during the Civil War. When those soldiers headed west to become cowboys, they brought the habit with them. The biscuits were so hard that men called them sheet iron, worm castles, or tooth dullers. Cowboys soaked them in coffee for 20 minutes just to make them chewable. Some crumbled hardtack into bacon grease and fried the mixture into a dish called ski iligali. The taste was bland, almost chalky, but the calories were undeniable. A single cracker delivered nearly 75 calories of pure survival. Trail journals from the 1870s record the sound of hardtack cracking between teeth around evening campfires. Men complained bitterly, yet reached for another piece. When supply wagons ran late across the plains, hardtack was often the only thing standing between a cowboy and starvation. Number 24, so belly and beans. The backbone of the cowboy diet arrived in wooden barrels packed with salt. So belly, the cured belly of a pig, could travel for months without refrigeration. Chuck wagon cooks sliced it thick, fried it until the fat rendered crisp, then tossed beans into the same pan to soak up the drippings. By 1880, a pound of salt pork cost roughly 12 cents at frontier trading posts. It was cheap enough that ranch foremen budgeted nearly $200 per month for a crew of 12. The beans, usually pintos or brown beans, were purchased in 100 lobby sacks and rationed carefully across long drives. The smell of frying spelly drifting across the prairie told tired cowboys that supper was close. Men ate with tin plates balanced on their knees, scooping beans with chunks of bread and scraping every last drop of grease. The combine was greasy, salty, and monotonous, but it delivered the fat and protein that hard labor demanded. Number 23, spotted pup. When the trail cook wanted to lift spirits, he reached for rice and raisins. Spotted pup was the cowboy's version of dessert, a simple pudding of boiled rice studded with plump raisins and sweetened with molasses or brown sugar. The dark raisins scattered through the pale rice gave the dish its name. Supply wagons carried dried fruit precisely because it traveled well and provided desperately needed variety. A 10 lb box of raisins might cost 90 cents in Abilene and last a crew through 2 weeks of driving. Cowboys who recorded their memories decades later often mentioned spotted pup with surprising fondness. One trail hand from the Chisholm Trail recalled the dish as the closest thing to home his outfit ever tasted. Served warm from the Dutch oven, spotted pup cut through the endless monotony of beans and bacon with a sweetness that felt almost festive. When supplies ran low, the cook stretched the raisins thin and men picked through their portions, counting each one. Number 22, coffee gravy. When a chuck wagon ran short of milk, and it almost always did, cowboys improvised. Coffee gravy started with pan drippings from the morning's bacon, thickened with flour, and loosened with leftover coffee instead of milk or water. The result was a dark, bitter gravy that covered biscuits and salt pork alike. The taste was harsh, tannic, and deeply savory. Men raised on their mother's cream gravies might have winced at the first bite, but after a week on the trail, coffee gravy tasted like innovation itself. The caffeine in the gravy provided a mild boost, and the fat from the drippings delivered calories that kept men working through brutal days. Oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s recorded aging cowboys who still made coffee gravy in their own kitchens decades after the last great trail drives ended. The dish was ugly, unconventional, and utterly practical. When flour ran low or cost too much, cornmeal stepped in. Corn dodgers were dense little cakes of cornmeal, salt, and water shaped by hand, fried in bacon, grease, or baked on a flat rock near the fire. They came out heavy, golden, and filling enough to anchor a meal when nothing else was available. Cornmeal cost roughly half what wheat flour did at frontier trading posts, making it essential for budget-minded trail bosses. A 50 lb sack could stretch for weeks if the cook was careful. The texture was gritty, the flavor plain, but corn dodgers soaked up gravy and bean liquid like nothing else. Cowboys stuffed them in pockets for the long hours between meals, gnawing on cold dodgers while pushing cattle through Aos and across swollen creeks. Some cooks added bits of crumbled bacon or a spoonful of molasses to the batter. Small luxuries that men remembered for years. Number 20, fried salt pork with red-eye gravy. When cowboys wanted something that passed for a proper breakfast, the cook reached for salt pork and strong coffee. Thick slices of cured pork were fried until the edges curled and browned. Then, while the pan still sizzled, the cook poured in black coffee, scraping up every bit of caramelized fond. The liquid bubbled and reduced into a thin reddish gravy with a name that matched its appearance. The bite of the coffee cut through the heavy salt of the pork, creating something almost balanced. Men sopped up the gravy with whatever bread was available, chasing every drop across their tin plates. Trail boss accounts from the 1870s note that red-eye gravy appeared most often on mornings after difficult nights, when the cook took pity on exhausted men and offered something beyond the usual monotony. The dish required nothing that was not already in the chuck box, yet it felt like generosity. Number 19, Poes strawberries. Out on the plains, real strawberries were a fantasy, but beans were everywhere, and cowboys developed a dark humor about their diet. PCO strawberries was the trail name for plain red beans, served so often that men joked they might as well be fruit. The beans were soaked overnight when time allowed, then simmered for hours with whatever flavoring the cook could manage. They used salt pork, chili peppers, wild onions, or just salt and water. Some outfits ate beans twice a day for weeks at a stretch. A single serving could deliver nearly 15 dreed of protein, critical fuel for men burning thousands of calories in the saddle. Diaries from the Goodnight Lovin' Trail record cowboys eating beans with every meal for 30 consecutive days. Complaints were frequent, but always followed by empty plates. Beans sustained the cattle industry, one humble serving at a time. First pattern break. Here is where the truth about cowboy cooking gets interesting. The chuck wagon, invented by Charles Goodnight in 1866, was not just a kitchen. It was a pharmacy, a tool shed, and a morale station rolled into one. The hinge box at the rear, the chuck box, contained everything from sourdough starter to castor oil. Cooks guarded their wagons with fierce territorial pride. Any cowboy who reached into the chuck box without permission risked a ladle across the knuckles, or worse. The cook's status on a trail drive was second only to the trail boss himself. He woke before dawn, slept after midnight, and had final say over what men ate and when they ate it. His mood could make or break a drive. Cowboys learned to complement the coffee even when it tasted like boiled saddle leather. Number 18, vinegar pie. Fresh fruit was almost impossible to keep on the trail, but cowboys still craved sweetness. Vinegar pie solved the problem with pantry staples that traveled well. Cooks mixed vinegar, sugar, eggs, flour, and a bit of vanilla or nutmeg into a filling that remarkably tasted something like lemon pie once baked. The acidity of the vinegar mimicked citrus well enough to fool exhausted taste buds. The pie was tangy, sweet, and smooth, a revelation after weeks of heavy starches and salt. Ranch wives baked vinegar pies through the Depression era and beyond, but the dish traces its music roots to the ingenuity of frontier cooks who could not let something as minor as missing lemons stand between their crew and dessert. Cowboys who tasted it once requested it for weeks afterward. Number 17, prairie oysters. This dish separated the true West from its Eastern imagination. Prairie oysters were not shellfish. They were calf testicles harvested during spring roundups when young bulls were castrated to make them easier to handle. A skilled cook would peel away the outer membrane, slice the delicate meat thin, dredge it in flour, and fry it fast in hot lard until golden. The flavor was mild, almost sweet, with a tender texture that surprised first-timers. Cowboys considered them a seasonal delicacy, available only during branding season when the work was hardest and the reward most needed. Eastern journalists who visited cattle ranches in the 1880s expressed shock at the dish, but ranch hands ate prairie oysters with relish, knowing that wasting any part of the animal was simply not done. Modern Rocky Mountain oyster festivals continue the tradition, though few participants know the dish was once a necessity, not a novelty. Number 16, sourdough biscuits. The sourdough starter was the most valuable item in any chuck wagon. Cooks guarded their crocks of fermented flour and water with almost religious devotion, keeping them warm against their bodies on cold nights to prevent the wild yeast from dying. Each morning, the cook would pull a portion of starter, mix it with flour, lard, and a pinch of baking soda, then bake the biscuits in a Dutch oven buried in coals. The result was tangy, flaky, and vastly superior to anything made with commercial yeast. Trail records show that a good cook might bake 60 biscuits each morning for a crew of 12. Men ate them with beans, gravy, or molasses, stuffing extras into pockets for later. When a starter died from cold or contamination, it was a genuine crisis. Some starters traveled thousands of miles across dozens of drives passed from cook to cook like living heirlooms. Number 15, jerky. Long before the vacuum-sealed bags at gas stations, jerky was survival itself. Cowboys cut beef into thin strips, salted it heavily, and dried it in the sun or over low smoke until the moisture vanished and the meat turned dark and leathery. Properly made jerky could last for months without refrigeration. Trail hands stuffed strips into saddlebags for the long hours between meals, chewing slowly to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. The process was borrowed from indigenous peoples who had perfected the technique over centuries. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat and fat, represented the pinnacle of preserved protein, but plain jerky remained the everyday staple. A pound of dried meat could sustain a man through a full day's ride when nothing else was available. Number 14, son of a gun stew. Here is the dish that shocked Eastern visitors and sustained Western cowboys. Son of a gun stew, known by a considerably saltier name around actual campfires, used every edible part of a freshly slaughtered calf, including heart, liver, sweetbreads, tongue, brains, eyes, and the marrow gut, the tube that connects the two stomachs of a calf and contains partially digested milk. The marrow gut gave the stew its distinctive richness, a creamy, almost sweet quality that no other ingredient could replicate. Cooks simmered the organs with onions, chili peppers, and whatever vegetables were available until the mixture thickened into something deeply flavorful. Cowboys considered son of a gun stew a celebration prepared only when fresh beef was available, usually after an animal was injured and had to be slaughtered. The dish wasted nothing, honored the animal, and fed the crew with nutrition that beans alone could not provide. It was practical, respectful, and utterly essential. Second pattern break. Here is what modern nutrition science confirms. Cowboys eating son of a gun stew were consuming organ meats that delivered concentrated doses of vitamins A, B12, iron, and zinc, nutrients that kept men healthy through brutal physical labor. The instinct to eat the whole animal was not just economical, it was biologically sound. Researchers studying traditional diets now recognize that nose-to-tail eating provided nutritional completeness that muscle meat alone cannot match. Our great-great-grandfathers knew this without laboratories or studies. They knew it because wasting food was unthinkable, and because the men who ate well worked harder and lived longer. Number 13, bear sign. When a trail cook really wanted to be popular, he made bear sign. These were fried donuts, simple rounds of sweetened dough dropped into hot lard until they puffed golden and crisp. Rolled in sugar while still warm, they were the closest thing to bakery pastry that the trail could offer. Making bear sign required time, patience, and a generous amount of lard. Luxuries that not every cook could afford. When word spread that tonight's dessert was bear sign, men worked faster, knowing that rewards waited at the end of the day. The name likely came from the shape, round and brown like bear droppings, or perhaps from the excitement the treat generated, as if the cook had found something as rare as bear tracks on the prairie. Either way, bear sign entered the vocabulary of the trail as a synonym for something special. Number 12, stewed dried apples. Dried apples traveled in burlap sacks that could withstand weeks of jostling in the supply wagon. When the cook wanted to break the monotony, he would simmer those leathery rings in water with sugar and a bit of cinnamon until they plumped into something that almost resembled fresh fruit. The aroma alone lifted spirits. Men who had eaten nothing but meat and beans for weeks would close their eyes at that first bite, remembering orchards and farmhouses and the mothers who had packed dried apples into their saddlebags when they left for the territories. By 1875, dried apples cost roughly 10 cents per pound at frontier general stores, affordable enough that even budget-conscious trail bosses included them in supply lists. The dish appeared at the end of meals, a small sweetness to carry men through until morning. Along the Texas-Mexico border, vaquerero traditions shaped cowboy cooking. Pandempo, or camp bread, was a simple flatbread made from flour, lard, baking powder, salt, and water. Cooked in a Dutch oven or directly on a flat rock, it emerged chewy, slightly charred, and perfect for scooping beans or sapping gravy. The technique required no rising time, no careful kneading, and no special equipment. A cook could produce fresh bread in under 20 minutes if the fire was right. Mexican and Texan cowboys passed the recipe back and forth across generations, adapting it to whatever ingredients were available. Some added bits of bacon or chili pepper to the dough. Others kept it plain, respecting the bread's role as a neutral canvas for whatever else the meal offered. Number 10, chuck wagon chili. The chili that cowboys actually ate bore little resemblance to the bean-heavy versions that dominate modern competitions. Trail chili was primarily meat, usually beef or venison, stewed with dried chili peppers, garlic, onions, and cumin. Beans, when they appeared at all, were served alongside rather than mixed in. The dish traced its roots to the chili con carne of San Antonio, where Mexican and Anglo foodways collided into something new. By the 1880s, chili queens sold their versions from open-air stands in Military Plaza, and cowboys carried the taste back to ranches across the West. The heat of the peppers preserved the meat slightly and masked any off flavors that might develop in the days before refrigeration. A pot of chili could simmer for hours, improving music with time, feeding men in shifts as they rode in from work. When canning technology became affordable in the 1870s, Tyndall tomatoes transformed chuck wagon cooking. Cowboys ate them cold, straight from the can, as a refreshing break from heavy starches. They ate them stewed with rice mixed into beans or cooked down into primitive sauces. The acidity of tomatoes cut through the grease of fried pork. The moisture provided relief on dusty trails. The vitamins, particularly vitamin C, helped prevent scurvy on long drives when fresh produce was impossible. Trail outfits began budgeting for canned goods by the case, recognizing that a few cents per tin was worth the boost to morale and health.